Awesome. Welcome, everyone. This is the Boat on Course session, rule number 16, with Captain Pam Dillon. This is going to be the action by giveaway vessel. Welcome, everyone, and we will go ahead and let Captain Pam take the lead on today's session. Welcome, Captain Pam Dillon.
Thank you, Bree, and welcome Alan and Peg and Alexis and any others who may be joining the recording. My name is Captain Pam. I am a Coast Guard captain license. I just have an OUPV, but that allows me to train a lot of people on the water. You can see some of the background that I have. I like to summarize my background. I say I help save lives by developing and implementing and training to national standards and best practices of boating safety. If you has already been mentioned, the session will be recorded, and as we move forward, I just urge you all, if you have any questions, raise your hands, use the chat feature to tell us your name, where you're located, and even a bit about yourself. And you can also use the reaction features in Zoom. That's always a little bit of fun if you want to comment that way. I've done a few of these now, and I really appreciate the different, I guess, approaches that Coast Guard captains have used in these sessions. I always want to start by reminding people that really why we are doing this. And did you know that navigation rule violations are among the top 10 known primary contributing factors of boating incidents? You can see here from the 2024 statistics that 288 accidents or incidents were recorded with the Coast Guard, and that included 77 or 17 deaths and 163 injuries. So navigation rule violations are something we really need to focus on and be aware of. Today we are going to talk about Rule 16, but it's important to remind everybody that we got to put that in context. And Rule 1 of, and I'll just reference the inland rules primarily. A lot of the international rules are very consistent with these. But focus on the inland rules because that applies to the majority of the continental United States. These rules apply to all vessels upon the inland waters of the United States and to vessels of the United States on the Canadian waters of the Great Lakes, to the extent that there is no conflict with Canadian law. And as I said, navigation rule violations are a common source of near misses and incidents because operators misjudge stopping distance and maybe don't understand operator responsibilities. So we're going to take a look at some of those operator responsibilities. These rules are published in the U.S. Coast Guard Navigation Rules and Regulation Handbook, and I encourage y'all, if you haven't downloaded a copy or have a print version as a reference to that should be step one in your navigation rules journey, is to download this information. It's available free of charge for the electronic versions. And the amalgamated navigation rules really just combine the international and the inland rules into one reference. In the actual print version, these are shown side by side. And if you go to this Coast Guard website, you'll see these spelled out pretty much as, distinguishing between the international and inland rules and where they may coincide, or if there's any differences, it will spell that out. But going back to the navigation rules, there's a general part, part A, and then part B are steering and sailing rules. and conduct of vessels in any condition of visibility. And a lot of the traditional rules of the road, as we all say, are in any condition of visibility. But then you go into conduct of vessels in sight of one another. And so many of these situations, if you're just out floating around on the water and there's lots of boats and but they're way over there, you don't have to worry about how these rules apply. But when they are in sight of one another and when it is apparent that there is a risk of collision, that's when these various rules really kick in. And these are just a number of the rules that have been reviewed in previous sessions of Boat on Course or upcoming sessions of Boat on Course. And of course, today we're going to look at action by a giveway vessel, and that is rule number 16. So what does it say? And I want to thank Bree because she gave me this assignment, and it's actually the shortest rule in all of the NAV rules. Rule 16 is just a one sentence rule, and that's action by giveway vessel. Every vessel which is directed to keep out of the way of another vessel shall, so far as possible, take early and substantial action to keep well clear. So that is the entirety of Rule 16, but let's dive into what that means. Every vessel that is directed to keep out of the way of another vessel. So if you go into other rules of the road and navigation rules, Boat on Course recordings, we've already talked about crossing situations, meeting head-on situations. Upcoming is overtaking, I believe, situations, but there are clear direction on what is the preferred course of action for each of these. And you can see here that giveway vessel and crossing situation. We've talked about turning to starboard, turning right, so that the stand-on vessel, and the stand-on vessel is going to be discussed more in a future Boat on Course session. But there's clear actions, whether you're meeting head on, whether there's an overtaking situation, there's clear actions that are preferred for each of these vessels to adhere to. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail except to really dive into what it means to be a giveway vessel. Because giveway vessel in the navigation rules, and this was a surprise to me as I started preparing for this session, there's only two mentions of specifically of giveway vessel in the nav rules in addition to Rule 16, which we just looked at in its entirety. Both of the mentions of giveway vessels specifically are in Rule 17, which is an action by a stand-on vessel. And as I said, that this is covered in another section of Boat on Course. But just to summarize these two items, it says, when from any cause the vessel required to keep her course and speed finds herself so close that collision cannot be avoided by the action of the giveway vessel, and this is from the stand-on vessel, which is the counter vessel to this. If they are standing on and they're seeing that the action of a giveway vessel is not sufficient for that giveway vessel to avoid a collision, then it's saying that this stand-on vessel shall take such action as will best aid to avoid collision. It also says in this stand-on rule that the rule does not relieve the giveway vessel of her obligation to keep out of the way. Now, I mentioned that these are the only two references in the navigation rules that specifically say give way, but there are many other references that say keep out of the way of another vessel. As a matter of fact, the inland rules include the phrase keep out of the way 14 times. And so to go back to this definition of give way vessel, it says every vessel that is directed to keep out of the way of another vessel shall, so far as possible, take early and substantial action to keep well clear. So, in order to understand give way vessel, you need to understand and keep in mind this phrase keep out of the way, because even though give way is not is limited in the number of uses in the nav rules, the phrase keep out of the way is referenced many, many times, and so it applies by definition of Rule 16. And I'll start just at the very top to review many of these references. Under general definitions, it talks about vessels not under command, and specifically that they are unable to keep out of the way of another vessel. So if you are interacting with a vessel not under command, you are by definition the one that is required to keep out of the way, because this vessel not under command is unable to keep out of the way. The same applies for a vessel restricted in her ability to maneuver, and that's based on the nature of her work. But because of the nature of her work, she is unable to keep out of the way of another vessel. And a reminder that those vessels that are restricted in their ability to maneuver can be involved in any number of work type of operation or transportation, launching, recovery of aircraft. There's a specific list under general definitions of vessels restricted in her ability to maneuver. Rule 17, we've already looked at that action of a stand-on vessel, and we talked about how giveaway vessel is cited there, but this action of a stand-on vessel also talks about keeping out of the way. So, for instance, just to review this, when there's two vessels, where one of two vessels is to keep out of the way, there's the phrase again, the other shall keep her course and speed, and talks about that as soon as it becomes apparent to her that the vessel required to keep out of the way is not taking appropriate action in compliance of the rules, that the first stand-on vessel may keep out of the way. And we've already said that this rule does not relieve that giveaway vessel in her obligation to keep out of the way. Another rule is found in the responsibilities between vessels. And again, this hierarchy of vessels talk about keeping out of the way. It doesn't use give way per in the actual rule, but it implies that when you keep out of the way, the vessel that is obligated to keep out of the way is, in fact, in many lingo, many of our education courses, many ways that we just routinely reference this, is to say that this vessel is the giveaway vessel in these kind of situations. So a power-driven vessel underway shall keep out of the way of, there's that vessel not under command, restricted her in her ability to maneuver, engaged in fishing, a sailing vessel, and right down through that hierarchy that we have talked about previously in boat on course sessions. So that is Rule 18, responsibilities between vessels. Sailing vessels also describe actions not only um, obviously when sailing and powerboats are meeting, but when two sailing vessels are approaching each other, and one of them shall keep out of the way. And it describes about the wind being on a different side. So the vessel which has the wind on her port side shall keep out of the way, aka give way to the other. When they both have the wind on the same side, the vessel that is windward shall keep out of the way of the vessel that is leeward. And you can hear this often in sailing regattas that as vessels are approaching each other, sailing vessels are approaching each other, people will call out um, Lord or port, or they'll call these out to each other to show that they are claiming that stand on privilege, and the other shall keep out of the way for this. So the sailing rules can be a lot of fun, especially in sail racing situations where knowledge of the rules and being able to acknowledge them and communicate those to other sailing vessels that may be approaching. Really important aspects on how to win a sailing race is you got to know your sailing rules, and the other one has to keep out of the way. So it's important for risk of collision avoidance as well. Another item where it talks about keep out of the way, or in our case, where we're referring back to that Rule 16 definition of being the give way vessel, is an overtaking, and that is any vessel overtaking any other vessel shall keep out of the way of the vessel being overtaken. This also goes on, though, to refer to, and this is in section D, any subsequent alteration of the bearing between the two. And they're talking about constant bearing, reducing distance, that the two vessels, when they are in an overtaking situation, that the overtaking vessel is not relieved of her duty to keep clear of the overtaking vessel until she is finally passed and clear. So while it doesn't say keep out of the way, it does also refer to the duty of keeping clear in Rule 13, which is the overtaking rule. In the crossing situation rule, which is Rule 15, it talks about, again, the vessel which has the other on her own starboard side shall keep out of the way, and shall, if circumstances of the case admit, avoid crossing ahead of the other vessel. So again, where we commonly reference that in a crossing situation that we have a stand-on vessel and the other should keep out of the way or give way, but the actual rule says keep out of the way. So don't overlook this when you're thinking about give way circumstances. In the inland rules specifically, I want to remind everyone that a power-driven vessel crossing a river shall keep out of the way of a power-driven vessel ascending or descending the river. So you've got a situation where you've got river traffic going both upstream and downstream, and a power-driven vessel crossing shall also keep out of the way or give way in those kind of circumstances. So I wanted to put all that in context because this simple Rule 16, which is action by a giveway vessel. Um, while the giveway vessel is pretty simple rule, that basically again says every vessel which is directed to keep out of the way of another vessel shall, as far as possible, take early and substantial action to keep well clear. So we've explored this, what this first part of the rule is saying, and that is to keep out of the way. But let's take a deeper look into this take early and substantial action to keep well clear. If you take any type of boating education course, there is a lot of information that is provided specifically on crossing situations, meeting head-on situations, and overtaking situations. There is specific directions on preferences of what to do, how to respond, and what is expected. But the NAV rule also says take early and substantial action to keep well clear. And the takeaway from this is that you want to make that action that you are taking as a giveaway vessel, you want to make it big, you want to make it apparent, and you want to make it so that there's no confusion of what action you are taking when you find yourself in that giveaway vessel situation. So in a crossing situation, the preferred action is to turn right or to turn to starboard. Make that turn very evident that you are turning. So the stand-on vessel is not confused at all. In an overtaking situation, make that action that you are going to pass, whether on the port side or the starboard side of the vessel being overtaken, make that action big enough that people understand on that stand-on vessel that they understand what you're doing, and use the appropriate horn signals that we've talked about in previous boat on course sessions. Meeting head on, make your actions substantial and apparent. And that is really the key in understanding this NAV rule. So that's really it. Pretty simple. Remember that the navigation rules lead to predictable boating behavior. And understanding and adhering to the navigation rules can help us reduce one of the primary contributing factors to boating incidents, and those are navigation rule violations. Primary reason that people take boating safety courses, primary reason that people get their Coast Guard captain's licenses and adhere to safe boating practices is to understand and apply the navigation rules appropriately. So I want to see if there's any questions, comments. It's a pretty straightforward statement, but there's a lot of context there that we also need to take a look at. Any questions, comments?
Captain Payne, you did an excellent, excellent job discussing this rule. So I want to give you kudos on that. And I would say that this is one of the most important rules for safety for recreational boaters. So I hope that when a bunch of other people watch this recording, they learn from it and practice it.
Thank you, Captain Peg.
It was an excellent presentation, very clear.
Job.
Thank you, Alan. Well, I would like to remind you of continuing Boat on Course training sessions. August 11 looks at Rule 8, which is the action to avoid a collision. That's with Captain Alan Dennison. And I will leave you with an end quote, and this one is from Kenneth Graham. There is nothing, absolutely nothing, half so much worth doing as simply messing around in boats. It's one of my favorite quotes, and I just want to say thanks for participating in this session on Boat on Course. And as always, there's more information at the safeboatingcouncil.org website, as well as the boatoncourse.com website. So thank you for joining us today, and happy boating.